this is a big topic to cover, because when I just talk about setting up simply a worm bin, I take an hour and a half. Large scale, that can take all day. So I'm trying to condense everything into about half an hour. And so, I'm just hitting the highlights here, but thank goodness I have all these resources that will help fill it in. And plus I'll be able to answer your questions at the end. So first of all, so we're here because Chelsea Green invited me to talk about my book, The Worm Farmer's Handbook, Mid to Large Scale Vermicomposting for Farms, Businesses, Municipalities, Schools, and Institutions. So hopefully many of you already have this book. Um, it's got a lot of chapters, a lot of things that I addressed. And so this is just kind of a overview of some of the things that I cover, and they're not in this order. I just kind of threw these down, but so the effect of vermicast on soils and plants is in the book. How you choose a production system. How are you going to find and manage your feedstocks? Then once you have a worm bed going, how you're going to monitor it. And then when it's time to harvest, how you're going to get the vermicast out of there and screen and test it and package and store it. And then markets for earthworms and vermicast, avoiding common pitfalls, regulatory issues, which many of you will have, business and marketing plans, which is actually towards the beginning of the book, because it's so important to have a plan if you're going to do it on a mid to large scale. And then vermicomposting operations around the world. I highlighted that because it's really, there's no one way to do it. So it's really important to see how different people are doing it. And as you look at the color pictures and read about these different operations, there's probably, I'd say, 24 operations that I cover in the book. And then the light bulb will go on in your head, and you'll say, wow, this sounds right for me. Because we don't all have the same resources. Some people have deeper pockets than others. And so, so I like to make this available for everyone. And so, you'll get it inspired by what you can see that others are doing. So, but I have more information as well on vermicomposting. I have a website that's packed with information. I've been at NC State, North Carolina State University for over 27 years. And so, we're going back over a quarter of a century there. And so I have lots and lots of publications because, we didn't do videos 27 years ago. So I've got videos. I've had a dozen podcast interviews in the past year. And so I have those on my website. This worms can recycle your garbage. This is for everyone, okay? Unless you're, if you're new to vermicomposting, you really, or if you've been doing vermicomposting, but you're having problems and you're trying to figure out what's wrong with my bin. Read Worms Can Recycle Your Garbage. It's only 5 pages. It's free on my website. Just download it, take a look. But I think it'll answer a lot of your questions about how to set up a small worm bin, which you need to do. I'm alarmed by the number of people who contact me and say, oh, I heard about vermicomposting, and somebody approached me. They have all of this feedstock. They'll give it to me for free. So I want to start a worm business, a vermicomposting business. And they've never even raised a worm. And it's like, seriously? I mean, if I told you to go home and well, you are home. We're all home right now. But, it'd be like just running out and buying a cow. And how do you take care of a cow? Well, that would give you pause. If I said, go get a cow, you'd be like, whoa, I better read up on this. I better figure out. animal husbandry for that cow. And so I'm just surprised that some people are pretty cavalier about worms. Like, they're only worms, they're easy. And it's like, no, they have similar needs to cows. So you really have to be serious about this. So worms can recycle your garbage on my website is where you want to start. It does have a troubleshooting guide as well. Also on my website, you'll find a vermicomposting curriculum. So if any of you work with youth, either in schools or after school or scouts or church groups, you know, any kind of situation where you're working with youth, um, this vermicomposting curriculum is really helpful, and kids always get excited about worms. So it's great. And then I do the section of my website with the most information is large scale vermicomposting, because people contact me from all over the world and they want to learn about large scale vermicomposting. So, so just check that out. So vermicomposting, for any of you who are, new to this and wondering what it is. So it's a process relying on earthworms and microorganisms. So they're working together to help break down organic materials, and then they're turning them into a very valuable soil amendment and a source of plant nutrients. And vermicomposting is very different from composting. So I want to start this off by delineating the differences between the two methods. Because vermicomposting has that word in it, composting, I think people think, oh, it's similar. I made a note on the left side here. They're two separate methods that should not be combined. I hear all the time where people say, oh, my compost bin isn't doing very well. So I heard if I add worms, that it'll make my pile better. And it's like, no, your compost pile is different. It's designed to be different. You will find earthworms that show up to the bottom of your pile where it's cool. And so these are worms in the environment that are attracted to the organic materials, but you should never add worms to a compost pile. So the difference is, let's look at composting. So I'm talking about thermophilic composting, like what you would do in your backyard, or perhaps your community is picking up your yard waste or your food waste, and they're taking it to a municipal facility, or they're taking it to a private composting facility. Well, it will take a good 6 to 9 months for that material to be processed and ready to use. Because as you can see, I've got a compost thermometer, compost temperature grid on the bottom. That's my finger pointing down. But anyway, this shows that you start out at mesophilic temperatures, and then, you know, the temperatures in the pile are supposed to go high, and then while the food is being consumed, and then it comes down, and then see this long line at the end of it. That's the curing. It has to cure and mature, because if you just take hot compost and put it on your plants, then it's going to burn the plants. So you want it to have time to cool down, and then during that maturation process, a lot of things take place that help to stabilize that compost. So again, it's supposed to be a thermophilic process. And it requires some sort of aeration or turning, okay? So those are kind of, you know, again, when I teach composting, that takes hours. So, you know, you just got it in 2 minutes. This is what composting basically is. So let's go to the left side of the screen and look at vermicomposting. You can see it's much faster, and you don't have to cure it at the end. When it comes out the end of a worm, it's stable. So this is a shallow process, okay? And so it's really important to remember that. Shallow, meaning it's not going to be deep. It's going to be about 2 feet deep, and that's it. Whereas any of you familiar with composting know that you need a pile that's about 3 by 3 by 3, I like to say 4 by 4 by 4. You need that mass. So sorry, I know people from around the world are tuned in, and I'm American, so unfortunately when I talk it's in, you know, non-metric usually. But anyway, you know, so 4 feet by 4 feet by 4 feet is what you would need for composting. But for vermicomposting, no deeper than 2 feet. It's a mesophilic process. That means that the temperatures are going to remain low, okay? You want them to be low ambient temperatures. You don't want it to heat up. And you don't turn it. So, you know, so that's nice for any of you who have paid a lot of money for a turning machine for your compost. You don't need it for vermicomposting. So so that just kind of tells you some differences between vermicomposting and composting. Big difference in price, okay? So vermicompost, if you make it and you want to sell it, here in the United States, you can sell it for $200 to $1,000 per cubic yard. Pretty amazing, huh? But compost only sells for about $30 per cubic yard. So big difference in the value of the two products. And you'll notice I'm saying vermicompost, I'm saying compost. They are two separate things. And so if you could just make a note to yourself that they are two different processes and stop mixing the terminology. You know, I hear all the time people will refer to vermicompost or vermicast as compost, and it's not. And you can see the big difference here. All right, so sorry that I'm kind of in the way of the picture of me is in the way of the screen a little bit. But anyway, so like I said, vermicompost, which you're looking at in the middle, is fully stabilized, fine particulate structure, because guess what? It passed through a worm. So pretty tiny particles coming out the other end, right? It has nutrients that during the vermicomposting process, those nutrients have been transformed into forms that are readily taken up by plants. It's more microbially active than the parent organic material. And basically I call worms little microbe factories, because what goes in one end and what comes out the other, there are more microbes in what comes out the other end. It has high water holding capacity and the pH is near neutral. And what really makes it super special is that it has plant growth hormones and humic acids, and it has an amazing effect on plants. So I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about the effect on plants. So it will, if you add vermicast, so I did say vermicompost earlier, and now I'm saying vermicast. It's because the end product of vermicomposting is commonly called vermicompost, but I'm trying to get away from that term. So in my book, I called it vermicast, okay? So the effect on plants, boy, seeds will germinate more quickly and the plants will grow bigger and they will produce greater numbers of flowers and fruits and vegetables. So it's just, you know, whatever that plant produces, it will produce more with the addition of vermicompost. And so the plants are just healthier. They have more stress tolerance and they can be transplanted more easily. The root development is amazing. I'll show you a picture of an example of that. And it also can reduce attacks by plant pathogens, parasitic nematodes, and insect pests. So here's the turnip picture. Some of you may have seen this before, but this was an experiment that I did in my department with a couple of colleagues. This was, so, you know, I don't know, 15 years ago, but we had randomized plots in the field, 3 different seasons, different plots even, and we had, some plots had 0 vermicompost added. some had 10% by volume, and some had 20% by volume added to the soil. And this is representative of what happened to the plants. So on your far left, you can see turnip, a regular sized turnip. That's what it looks like. And look at the root. It's just, you know, one spindly root coming out. And then next to it in the middle, it had 10% by volume vermicompost added. And look at the effect. Look at the size of the turnip. Look at the root system. Talk about root development. And look at the turnip greens. I mean, you know, so if you're at a market selling turnip greens, look at how much more you can sell from one turnip. And then on the right, we have a turnip grown with 20% by volume vermicompost. And, you know, it's like, look at that. Look at the difference. And so by looking at this, you may think, oh my gosh, if we had added 100% by volume vermicompost, the turnip would be, you know, the size of my room, you know? I mean, looking at 0, 10, 20, you'd think, wow, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. But it doesn't. We didn't do 30 or 40%, but if we had, they'd be a little bit bigger, but probably not even as big as the difference between 10 and 20. And it's because there's kind of a bell-shaped curve with vermicompost. So additions, you know, they're from 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, all the way up to 100%. You'll see that really 10 or 20% is your sweet spot. And then 30 and 40% usually don't look that much different from 20%. Depends on the plant. Plants respond differently, but not enough of a difference that you would say, oh yeah, well, this vermicompost that I paid $1,000 a cubic yard for, I think I'll just throw, you know, this extra 10 or 20% in. You know, you don't want to do that. You want to save, you want to conserve that money and make that vermicompost stretch as far as you can. So the good news is that a little bit goes a long way. So just keep that in mind. So I want to show you that I don't have time to go into, you know, to cover this more in depth, but you can see for yourself what kind of studies have been done on vermicompost. Don't take my word for it that, you know, oh, it decreases plant pests and plant diseases. You can look it up for yourself. So Google Scholar, I encourage you to check it out. So if you have a Google browser, you know, the subject thing where you type in, you know, oh, I want to know about whatever, you type in Google Scholar, and then a different browser will come up that looks a lot like regular Google, but these are published journal articles. And so just a couple of weeks ago, I went to Google Scholar, and these are the key words that I typed in. Vermicompost, effect on plant growth. And in a third of a second, 31,300 scientific articles came up just on the effects of vermicompost on plant growth. And then vermicompost suppress plant disease. Vermicompost suppress plant pests. Vermicompost suppress plant parasitic nematodes. Thousands of articles on these topics. And I'm sure you can think of more topics that you would like addressed specifically. So, you know, and you could say vermicompost effect on tomato plants or, you know, whatever. And you will find these published journal articles. So I encourage you to check that out. So who is vermicomposting? It's taking place all over the place. And that's why I wrote this book, to be able to tell you that I have been in touch with everybody, every type of situation on this list. So businesses, schools, farms, community gardens, restaurants, grocery stores, food banks, universities, colleges, paper mills, military bases, hospitals, prisons, nursing homes, households, and then composters who, like compost manufacturers are using vermicompost to enhance the product. So, and even beyond this list, but this is what, I kind of came up with. And people in 117 countries have contacted me about vermicomposting during the 27 years that I've worked at NC State. So, you may have thought, well, I don't really know anybody, or somebody in my old neighborhood, they had a worm bin, or at my kids' school, one of the classrooms was doing it. And it's like, it's not limited to that. It is taking place on every continent in the world, except I haven't heard of one, and I haven't heard from anyone in Antarctica yet, but every other continent, people have contacted me to say, I want to learn more about vermicomposting. And it's usually about large scale. They want to get into commercial vermicomposting. All right, so this is super important to know because we're talking about earthworms, and you may think, well, I know what a worm is, they live in the soil, they eat the soil, end of story, But it turns out that there are over 9,000 species of earthworms, and scientists have divided them into 3 different groups according to where they live and what they like to eat. And so you've got the anisic group. They live in the soil in vertical burrows, because when we think of worms, we think of burrowing into the soil. And so that's what they do. They eat the soil, they come out sometimes and they'll grab some leaf litter and take it back into their burrow and eat it, okay? And then you've got the endogeeic earthworms, and they live in the soil in horizontal burrows and they eat soil. Okay, so we have 2 different groups that are totally following what we would expect of earthworms, right? Earthworm, live in the earth, eat the earth. Well, it turns out that there's a 3rd type of earthworm, and they are epigeic earthworms. Do you see any mention of soil? They don't live in the soil and eat the soil like the other 2 types of earthworms. They're living on top of the ground, under piles of leaves, or I've got a picture of cow poo there. If you're walking in a pasture and you see some cow dung and you see worms in it, those would be the epigeics, because they love to live in and eat decaying organic matter. And so it's this type of earthworm that we're going to use for vermicomposting. So when we set up a vermicomposting system, are we going to add a bunch of soil to it? No. Okay, so I want this to burn into your brain. So when you think of vermicomposting earthworms, you think no soil. They don't want soil. I need to give them organic matter to live in and eat. So out of those 9,000 species of earthworms, only 7 species have been identified by scientists that are suitable for vermicomposting. And it turns out that just 1 seems to work the best, even worldwide. So around the world, people are using Eisenia fetida earthworms. Now, people don't usually say, oh yeah, I've got some Eisenia fetida, because most people will use common names, just like, with, if we have rose bush cultivars, we usually say, yeah, I have a rose bush, instead of saying whatever the scientific name is. But I give you the scientific name so we're all on the same page. Around here, they're most often referred to as red wigglers. But when I travel around the world, I find it very interesting. Whatever country I go to, people call this California redworms, as if California has a special worm. But anyway, they are Eisenia fetida. They adapt really well to living in a bin, to being cultured, you know, because they are wild animals, right? But they adapt more easily to sort of staying put if you give them the right conditions. If you don't, they're going to want to flee like any animal would. And they tolerate a wider range of environmental conditions than other earthworms. So let's take a look at their cocoons real quickly. This is a match head. So these are tiny, tiny cocoons that contain 2 to 7 babies if it's Eisenia fetida, okay? Again, 9,000 species of earthworms. They have different numbers of babies that come out, but on average, 3 babies will come out of an Eisenia fetida egg cocoon, and they'll emerge 4 to 6 weeks after the cocoon is laid, unless the environmental conditions are bad, and then they'll actually stay in the cocoon even longer. So they're kind of lemon shaped and light shiny brown, and it takes a while for the babies to reach sexual maturity. So where you get Eisenia fetida, you always want to start with a pound, okay? So you're going to buy a pound of Eisenia fetida. That's going to be approximately 1,000. So when you get your pound of worms, you're not going to sit there and want to count 1,000 worms, but you should eyeball it and estimate, because I've gotten somebody's tried to give me a pound of worms and I've eyeballed it and gone, no, it really looks more like 30 or 300, but not 1,000. So it's really important to just kind of check it out and make sure that, yeah, that looks like about 1,000 worms. You're not going to want to get it from your yard because, you know, what are they? Well, what is that in your yard or your compost pile? You don't know for sure. And you really want Eisenia fetida, and you don't want, you know, a bunch of mixture other wild worms. And you don't want to just go to a bait shop, because I've got a picture here of bait cups, and each one costs a little over $3 each, but there's less than 30 in a cup, and you need 1,000. So so it would basically cost you about $122 to buy a pound of earthworms from a bait shop to get started in vermicomposting. That's way too expensive. And plus, then look at all of this waste you would have. All of this styrofoam would have to go to the landfill, which is not good, okay? So buy your worms from a worm grower, and you'll be spending about $25 to $50 a pound. You choose. So, you know, nowadays around here, it's usually around $30, $35 for a pound, okay? So this is what your animals are going to need, okay? You're going to do earthworm husbandry. So these are animals that you have to take care of, and so you have to know what their needs are. So they are cold-blooded. They're sensitive to the temperature. We're warm-blooded. We can kind of deal with cold and heat. We have mechanisms to deal with temperature changes, but they don't. So their sweet spot is 60 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. They can tolerate much wider conditions. Scientific literature says 32 to 95 degrees. I've had earthworms survive 10 degrees Fahrenheit for several days and over 100 degrees Fahrenheit for several days. But, you know, but humidity plays a big part. So, and so I don't want you to look at this and say, well, you know, I live in a really hot environment. It's above 80 degrees Fahrenheit. I couldn't keep the worms alive. But that's why you need to read my book, because I address that and I talk about what you can do for these different types of temperatures, okay? So you're just keeping the worms comfortable, and there are different things you can do to help to make their environment cooler or hotter as needed. Now, they breathe through their skin, and their skin has to stay moist. So moisture is very important. So I aim for about 80% moisture. That just needs to be in about the top 4 inches of your worm bin system, because the earthworms, you want them to stay towards the top. You don't want them throughout the system. And so there really should be a gradient. So, you know, the top 4 inches would be 80% moisture, and then it would get drier the deeper you go into the bin, okay? They're sensitive to ammonia and salt, and so chicken manure and chicken litter is really high in ammonia, so you would not want to just give them straight chicken manure. And watch the salts, you know, so hog manure, they have a salty diet, and so, you know, so it can be a little bit of an issue, but, you know, just be aware. They need oxygen, but they need that moisture, and so don't have a system that has so much oxygen coming in that the moisture is wicked away, okay? So you have to have a good balance of the two. And then pH, you want to aim for neutral, but Eisenia fetida can tolerate between 5 and 9, okay? So like I said, they tolerate conditions a lot better than other earthworms. All right, so what will they eat? They will eat compost. So you can feed them compost. You can, and in my book, I talk a lot about pre-composting feedstocks. I'm a big believer in that. And so check that out in the book. If this is just for kitchen scraps, then no, you don't need to pre-compost them. But if you want to do something on a larger scale, then it's a good idea to pre-compost. They'll eat livestock manures, except for chicken. Vegetative food residuals, spoiled grain, coffee grounds, brewery waste, some brewery waste. Is there one, for example, one beer manufacturer in the world, or are there thousands? And they have different recipes. And so, you know, so anyway, I talk in the book about testing feedstocks, so, and not assuming that, you know, oh yeah, they should eat it because it's organic. So anyway, yard debris, cardboard, scrap paper, and crop residues. Those are the things they'll eat. So this is just one slide of different types of vermicomposting systems. So top left, we have a beginner worm bin where you make it yourself. You can pick up a storage container like this for less than $10, and then you can make your own holes in it. This is where you refer to my publication, Worms Can Recycle Your Garbage, for free on my website, okay? In the middle on the top, that's showing windrows, okay? So if you live in a mild climate, like out in California, I couldn't tell you the number of people who, even just in their backyards, they have windrows like this, where they don't come higher than your knee. This picture is of a farm that had 7 acres of windrows outdoors. And they were feeding them dairy manure, and you know, the worms did great. Top right, look at the concrete blocks. This is so common. People all over the world will take blocks like this. They're stacked too high, and that gives you the depth that you want, because remember, it's a shallow process. This is green organic in Afghanistan, which I did highlight in my book in chapter 10. And you can see that it's a nice, simple system, but it's used all over the place. Bottom left, again, shallow bins. So somebody built these bins, they put them in the shade, they put lids on them that were painted white, so it reflected any sunlight that may land on it, and they were vermicomposting horse manure. In the middle, this is in Chile, down in South America, And this is a simple outdoor system. They've got a roof to keep out the rain and the sun. And then, you know, they just have, we'll talk about horizontal harvesting in a little while, but that's the system they were using. And then bottom right, that's a continuous flow through system. This is kind of all the rage right now. A lot of people like this. So anyway, those are just, I mean, there's so many. I mean, I could spend hours and all kinds of pictures, but you will see all sorts of color pictures in my book about these systems. So these are the basics. All right. So if you were going to start a mid to large scale or even small scale, you start with about 6 inches of bedding. Okay. So you need to have moist bedding. This is what the worms live in. Okay. It gives them a habitat to exist in. You're going to add 1 pound of worms in a small bin like what I just showed you. All you need is 1 pound of worms. If you're going to do it on a larger scale, and especially if you're going to do it for production, you want 1 pound per square foot. Then you're going to apply about an inch layer of feedstock. Wait until it's gone, and then you'll add more feedstock. Okay. And then if it is food scraps, if it's, you know, table scraps, then you should cover it with something. Otherwise it could attract flies and, you know, vermin. So it's good to cover it with something. Bedding choices, again, this is for larger systems. My favorite to use is mature compost. So it's mature, it's stable, it's not high in soluble salts. Some people like to use aged horse manure. You should really make sure there aren't any persistent herbicides in it. And so I talk about that in the book as well. Some people will use aged leaf mold or shredded brown leaves. Some use shredded cardboard. Some will use coconut coir. Again, you might want to think about whether or not coconuts will grow in your area, because otherwise there's kind of a, you know, a carbon footprint to importing it. And this must be moist, okay? So, and if things are going well in your worm bin, then the inside should smell earthy like the forest. It shouldn't have any bad smells. You really shouldn't see the earthworms. If you see like a cluster of earthworms, that means they're uncomfortable. There's something wrong with your system. And you really want to check out my troubleshooting guide for that, okay? The content should be damp but not soggy. The earthworms really should have glistening skin. So, you know, when you look at them, you should see that their skin looks moist. It doesn't look dry. You will see other creatures in the bin. So these are decomposers that will help to decompose the organic materials, and the vermicast will accumulate on the bottom of the bin. I want to make a note that if you have, I'm going to try to move my thing here so you can see it. Okay, so some people have this dark, stinky liquid coming out of the bottom of their bin. It's anaerobic. It should not be happening. If you have a well-functioning worm bin, you should not have any liquid coming out of the bottom. You hear me? No liquid accumulating on the bottom or leaking out of the bin. And if it does come out, then it really shouldn't be used. I know that, you know, will it make your plants grow bigger? Yes, because it's got nutrients in it, but it's so unknown. We don't know about the nutrients. It could contain pathogens that could make you sick. It could have high salt and just, I don't know, it's all a mystery. So it's not suitable for food crops, and it really shouldn't be used on any plants that you value. And again, if you do have this liquid, you should look at the troubleshooting guide and go, wow, what am I doing wrong? Because you are doing something wrong. If you want to make tea, then you certainly can make vermicompost tea that can be wonderful for your plants, but you do that with finished vermicast. All right, so separating, I have to hurry up here, it's going too long. Several different methods, so I'm actually gonna just kind of run through these very quickly. You can read about this in my book, you can read it in the free publications on my website, so I don't have time to go into detail, but worms are sensitive to light, so if you have a small bin, you can dump out the contents and separate the vermicast from the worms. Sideways separation is used by anything from a small bin to a very large system. And basically you're feeding the worms in a way that gets them to move over. So in this bin, the whole bin used to be fed all at once. And then it became time to separate. And so you start only feeding on that other side and the worms will move over there after a few weeks. Same with vertical separation. You can get the worms to move from one bin up into another chamber or tray to help separate the worms from the vermicast. Another method, I talk about this in the book, remember the worms should be in the top 4 inches, so you're going to remove them and put it into a new bed, and then you can shovel out the rest of the vermicompost and then draw out any remaining worms by laying screen or mesh cloth on top with food on it. And again, they'll move through that to get to the food. Another thing is to have a screener. So these are different these are trommel screeners, and then the bottom left is a sifter. But basically they're separating the worms from the vermicast. Another is a continuous flow through bin. I briefly showed you a picture of that. This is the bottom of the bin. So it actually has, these are 2 by 4 inch grates, openings, and then there's a breaker bar that scrapes across the bottom there, and it will separate it'll shave off about 1 inch of vermicast that falls below onto the floor, or you can have a conveyor belt or a tarp or whatever to catch it. I talk about that a lot in my book. And then vermicast can be mixed into all sorts of things. So in your garden, lawn, around trees, nurseries, farm fields, vineyards love this stuff, golf courses, house plants. And then I just wanted to mention, some of you know that every year for 20 years, I've held a vermiculture conference that's 2 days. This is the weekend, October 24th to 25th is the weekend that I actually have a reservation on campus to hold it in Hunt Library, where I've held it for the past 5 years. I don't think it's going to happen because of the virus, but I do want to mention I'm working on trying to make this a 2-day webinar, live webinar. And so I'll have information coming out about that. I'm just, kicking around some ideas right now. So just wanted to show you that, again, my website, really important to check out the website, get lots of free stuff there. And then you've got your Worm Farmer's Handbook. Yes. And so that's why I was saying a little bit goes a long way. And actually, if you add, once you get past 50% by volume, then it actually has a negative effect on the plants. And so the plants that have no vermicompost will be comparable to plants that have over 50% by volume vermicast. It's just too much for the plants, So, so that's such good news because it's so expensive if you're going to buy it. Funny you should ask that. Yes, there was. We were really blessed that for over 30 years, we had someone with just amazing vermicomposting expertise. He was working with hog farms in North Carolina. Now he's in his 80s. He's aged out of doing that. And so, and the problem with vermicomposting well, let me say, and I talk about this in the book, that hog manure makes a wonderful um, feedstock for earthworms. Hog manure is incredible, and actually the resulting vermicast is, when Ohio State University was doing experiments with, they were using 4 different types of feedstocks. So they were getting vermicast that was made from kitchen scraps, or food waste. They were making it from dairy manure, from hog manure, and what was the other one that they were doing? Paper waste. Okay. And then they did all sorts of experiments on a wide variety of plants. And overall, they found that the vermicast that was made from hog manure outperformed the others. So hog manure is excellent for vermicomposting. Trying to get a hog farmer to adopt a vermicomposting system is hard because there is nothing easier or cheaper than just putting it in a hole in the ground, which is what they're allowed to do right now. And it's called a lagoon, but there's nothing cheaper or easier than that. So that's why vermicomposting and other alternative technologies are not being utilized. Oh, you know what? There are actually lots of tools online. Now that we're in the 2000s, and there really are. There are Facebook groups, and uh, yeah, on Facebook you'll find vermicomposting chat groups, and some are for commercial worm farms, and so you'll be able to find people through that. Good question. Worms obviously will reproduce fairly easily and quickly. Basically, every worm is a hermaphrodite, so that means they have the sex organs that it takes to produce a baby. Every worm contains that. You do need 2 worms to get together to produce, to exchange the sperm and eggs. But when those 2 worms, after they get together, and crawl away, they both are pregnant. So, and then they'll have those up to, around 3 babies per cocoon. But in a vermicomposting system, the population usually stabilizes. So it depends on what you're doing. And you can certainly breed worms separately and get lots of worms. But in a system with stable feed, they usually kind of even out. It could be used. Yep. I work for the state, and I have an extension appointment, um, and so I have to be really careful about what I tell people because, we don't want people to get sick, people and pets and children, to get sick. And pet waste will have pathogens. So dog and cat poo has pathogens that can make you sick. And so if you want to do that separately, you can, okay? You would not want to put it into, just a regular system and then use it on your organic garden. That's just not going to work. So, because you risk getting pathogens. But if you want to set up a separate system, you can certainly do that with either composting or vermicomposting. Yeah. There's different ways to do it. And, so no, I do not have Rhonda's favorite way of doing it. And we all have, yeah. And it's because, I work with people all over the world, and I work with people who don't have electricity. So I can't say, oh, you need this kind of motor and it's got to be this kind of horsepower or whatever, I mean, for some people, their method of aeration is just going to be using a stick, So, so there's a lot, there is information about vermicompost tea and compost tea. I'm so busy working with people all over the world about doing a really good job on vermicomposting, getting their, you know, helping them to get the right system that works for them and getting the right feeding and harvesting. That's a huge amount of stuff to be working on. And so frankly, I haven't had time to personally experiment with vermicompost tea and, you know, what's going to be best. So you just have to, you know, access those resources. But there's just so much, you know, on the internet nowadays. We're lucky that we can Google things. Yes. So I didn't put that on the, you know, again, I'm trying to cover small and large in this presentation. So it's a lot to cover, but I do, when I only talk about small scale systems, I do say, yeah, just use shredded newspaper or shredded office paper to set up a worm bin. And that's fine. The important thing is to moisten it. And so, you know, if you use shredded newspaper, then you want to put it in a bucket of water for 10 minutes so that it really absorbs the water into the fibers. And then you want to squeeze it out and then put it in the bin and fill your small bin about halfway full. That's for small systems. Now for large systems, you want to do the 6 inches of bedding, no more than 6 inches deep, okay? Because we don't want the system to heat up. Good, it's best to not kill any worms. And so I gave you a lot of choices, and actually the trommel screen or some type of screener is going to be harmful to the worms. And so you can harm the worms or kill them because, you know, it's like a trommel is spinning and, you know, gently spinning, but, you know, it does disorient the worms and they don't like vibrations as it is. And so, you know, so that's kind of, if we're thinking about the health and safety of the worms, that would be your least favorite option. With the other options, it's fine. You know, the light separation, the horizontal separation, the vertical separation, that other, even the fourth method, the fourth and fifth, all 5. So 5 out of 6 methods are gentle on the worms. No. Well, okay. You know what? That's a good question because, okay, so the one word response to this would be no. There aren't any plants, you know. It's good for a variety of plants, you know, and you'll see if you go to Google Scholar, you'll see there's, well, in my book, I summarize, I talk about the different plants where vermicompost has been tested on them. And so, but the exclusion, the one thing about that is if there's a problem with your vermicompost, then it could be bad for plants. And that's why I'm trying to, I think in chapter 9, that's where I talk about harvesting and storing and testing. And so, so you can send a sample of your vermicompost into a laboratory. Many states in the United States will have a state Department of Agriculture, and they may have a laboratory that normally tests soils, but some of them may also test vermicompost or compost or raw materials, and that's a separate test from soils. So I talk about that in the book. You want to make sure you're, you know, getting the right sample in there. But people have sent me test results, which again, I wouldn't send a test result to me. I you know, because I tell people about how to make good vermicompost. I am not a testing lab. So, you know, if you want If you want to know about your test results, contact the lab because they will tell you. But also in the book, I did talk about what the parameters should be for different nutrients and metals and all sorts of things in vermicompost. So check that out in chapter 9. But anyway, so sometimes people are like way off and somehow they manage to have really high levels of whatever, and that could be harmful to plants. Well, that's just it. Everybody's different. Everybody's got a different type of system of making vermicompost. Then they have different feedstocks. And then, and they have different moisture levels. They just have a variety of parameters. And then it depends on how you store it. And so that's why, again, in chapter 9 of my book, I talk about that and give some suggestions. So the vermicompost can last for years, 2 years from after you make it. It can still be very beneficial to plants if you're storing it correctly. It can be even longer than that, but again, it's in the finished product, you're going to have nutrients and then a plethora of microorganisms, just huge numbers of microbes and species of microbes. And so, and they're like the cow. Remember how I said, you got to think of taking care of living beings. And so microorganisms are living beings. So they have the same needs. They have similar needs as we do, and cows and worms. They need air, food, water, shelter. Okay, so so basically you have to keep that in mind, and you need to keep your microbes alive. Where can you get worms? Oh goodness. So there are worm growers throughout the United States. There are some people who hold full-time jobs, but they grow worms and produce vermicompost. And so, you can buy from them. And so there are, again, on Facebook, if you go to these earthworm grower groups, you can see who might be in your area. And then in the book, I talk about worm growers. And so, you can see who's, so worm farms around the country. So
okay.
Sometimes your extension agent will know about worm growers in the area. And also sometimes people who raise rabbits will put worm bins underneath their rabbit hutches, and the rabbit manure goes right into the worm bin. And so sometimes they have worms for sale as well. I don't recommend starting with less, because the number one problem with vermicomposting is that people overfeed. That, they're like, wow, there's 1,000 worms. And they're thinking that, hey, they're animals like my cat or dog. And boy, if my cat or dog senses food, they come running. And, and so worms aren't like that. It's a much slower process because, again, you have microbes and worms working together. So people just tend to overfeed. And on the internet, this is the misinformation you'll find on the internet. You'll see that people will say, oh, worms will consume 50 to 100% of their body weight per day. And it's not true. The reality is more like 25% to a third of their body weight per day. So they just don't eat as fast as you think they will. So you got the problem of people putting too much food in worm bins. And so you need, so it's important to start with as many worms as you can, you know? So yeah, if somebody starts, I've known many extension agents and teachers. I mean, you know, it's a lot to pay $35 for a pound of worms. And so, you know, they want to be able to split it up into half or a quarter, you know, so it stretches farther. But you're just, you know, if you start out with a quarter pound of worms or half pound of worms, then you have to put even less food in there. And, you know, and then whoever you're working with, whoever's using that worm bin will feel like, you know, well, hey, I put this food in and the worms just aren't doing anything. So anyway, that's why I say start with a pound. I think it's really important. Oh, okay, pre-treatment before you feed it to worms. Okay, so particle size is really important. I left that slide out because I was trying to, you know, make sure we got through this quickly. But I do talk a lot about particle size in my publications. And so the smaller the particle, the easier it's going to be for it to be broken down. Okay, so you know, and that doesn't mean running everything through a blender, because then it would get too soupy and liquidy, and you know, but basically you have microbes that are decomposing the whatever feedstock it is, and they don't have mouths, they don't have teeth, and so they're just secreting enzymes and just on the outer surfaces of the particle. And so in the book, I have a really nice graphic of, you know, a particle and then the effect of chopping that particle up and how it exposes more surfaces for the microbes to secrete their enzymes and break it down. And then earthworms, they don't have teeth and they have really tiny mouths. And so they are either consuming microorganisms or particles that are about the size of coffee grounds. So, you know, so just keep that in mind, that, you know, they should be pretty small particles. Oh, wow. If they're not hatching, then the conditions are not right. It may not be moist enough, okay? Because, you know, that's what's really cool about worm cocoons, is that um, they're they're hardwired that if the conditions are not correct for them, that they'll just keep the babies inside. So, you know, if it's too hot, too cold, too moist, or could be too moist, but more often too dry, um, that could be why they're not hatching. And it does take a while. So go back to my slide and check out how, you know, it's like 4 to 6 weeks before they'll hatch in normal, perfect conditions. And so if it's taking longer than that, you should definitely look at what your conditions are, what the environment is. Yeah, it depends. You know, I've known people who go out to eat all the time and all they eat is a banana a day. You know, um, and then you've got vegetarians and you have people who have their own garden. So it's for you to figure out. And so I will say that I think it's important to have a backyard composting system in addition to a worm bin if you are in a household situation. Um, because I've found I used to have a bin that was 4 feet by 4 feet in my backyard, and a worm bin, and it was not large enough to handle the feedstock that I had. You know, just from, you know, there were maybe 4 of us back then, and so it was not large enough. But so it depends on the household. So if you have a backyard composting bin, there are just, it can absorb this extra food waste. So I always like having a backyard bin. And on my website, you'll find that I have a publication about backyard composting that tells you how to effectively do backyard composting, which is pretty darn easy. So, and then people say, well, if you say have a worm bin and a backyard bin, why have both, you know? And so I want you to remember the slide that showed the value of the two different, you know, the compost and the vermicast and what they're worth. And that's what I keep in mind.